Nobody here dares defy me!
The slap echoed through the crowded cafe like a gunshot, and for 3 full seconds nobody in the room dared to breathe. A porcelain cup shattered against the marble floor, coffee spreading in a dark stain across the white tile, and the young woman at the corner table pressed 2 fingers to the corner of her mouth, drawing them back to find a thin line of blood. The man standing over her was laughing, tall and broad-shouldered, in a tailored blazer that cost more than most people in that room made in a month, and he looked around at the frozen faces like a king surveying subjects who had finally remembered their place. "Nobody here would dare touch him," he said, loud enough for every table to hear, because everybody in this city already knew whose blood ran through his veins. The woman did not cry. She did not raise her voice, did not beg, did not even glance at the dozen phones that had quietly come out to record the moment. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, dialed a single number, and said 4 words that nobody in that cafe would understand the weight of until 15 days later. "Begin the operation now." Within a quarter of an hour, machinery that had been waiting patiently in the shadows for months finally began to move, and the city that thought it belonged to one family was about to learn who it truly answered to. The city of Ashbourne Falls had been built brick by brick and favor by favor around the name Holloway. 3 generations of that family had run the town council, owned the largest construction firm, controlled the local bank's lending decisions, and sat on more nonprofit boards than anyone could count. And by the time Donovan Holloway became mayor at the age of 42, the family name had become something closer to a title than a surname. Donovan had built his reputation as the man of the people, a mayor who showed up at church breakfasts and Little League games, who cut ribbons with a warm smile and a practiced humility that made voters forget how much land his family actually owned beneath the surface of the city's paperwork. His son, Braden, had grown up inside that bubble of untouchability, attending the best private schools, driving cars gifted before he had even finished college, and learning early that consequences were something that happened to other people. By the time Braden turned 31, he had developed a particular talent for testing the limits of exactly how far his last name could carry him. And so far, it had carried him through every red light, every noise complaint, every shattered storefront window on a Friday night. The cafe on Cedar and Ninth was the kind of place that prided itself on quiet elegance, the sort of establishment where business deals were whispered over oat milk lattes and old money sat comfortably beside new. It was into this atmosphere that Zuri Langston had walked that morning, dressed plainly in a gray blazer and flat shoes, carrying a leather satchel instead of a designer handbag, choosing the corner table because it had the best view of the door. At 34, Zuri had spent a decade building a reputation that very few people in Ashbourne Falls had ever heard of, because the work she did was designed never to be loud until the moment it needed to be. She was a federal corruption attorney and co-founder of a watchdog organization that tracked municipal financial abuse across 3 states, and 2 months earlier the Department of Justice had quietly assigned her to lead an undercover assessment of Ashbourne Falls, a city whose finances had been raising red flags in Washington for the better part of a year. Nobody in that cafe that morning knew her name, her title, or the true reason she had chosen that particular table on that particular day, and that anonymity was exactly the point. Braden had walked in 20 minutes later, with 2 friends trailing behind him, already loud from a night that had apparently never ended, and he had set his sights on the corner table the moment he saw it occupied. It was, in his mind, the best table in the house, and best tables belonged to people like him. He approached Zuri with the practiced charm of someone who had never once been told no, informing her that she would need to relocate because he and his friends required that particular seating. And when Zuri looked up from her laptop and calmly told him there were 4 other empty tables just as good, something in his expression shifted from charm to contempt. He repeated the demand, sharper this time, and Zuri closed her laptop, folded her hands, and said that she had arrived first and intended to stay exactly where she was. The air in the cafe thickened, conversations dimmed to a hush, and Braden's friends exchanged uneasy glances as his jaw tightened and his voice rose loud enough for the entire room to hear him. He called her something ugly then, a word laced with more than just anger, a word that carried the weight of every assumption he had ever made about who deserved deference and who did not, and the manager behind the counter froze mid-pour. Zuri did not flinch. She simply repeated, evenly, that she was not moving, and it was that steadiness, that refusal to shrink, which seemed to unravel the last thread of Braden's patience. His hand moved before anyone could stop it, the sound of the slap cracking across the room like something breaking apart in the walls themselves, and the coffee cup on her table tipped and shattered against the floor as her head snapped to the side. For a long, suspended moment, nobody moved. Not the manager, not his friends, not the dozen strangers whose morning had just become something they would talk about for years. And into that silence, Braden laughed the laugh of a man who believed, down to his bones, that nothing that happened in that room could ever touch him. The silence that followed was its own kind of violence, thick and suffocating, the sort of quiet that comes from an entire room deciding, almost as one organism, that saying nothing was safer than saying anything at all. The manager, a nervous man named Peter Ellison, who had worked at that cafe for 6 years and watched Braden Holloway break glasses and skip tabs a dozen times before, hurried over not to comfort Zuri, but to apologize on Braden's behalf, whispering that perhaps it would be best not to make a scene, that these things had a way of resolving themselves quietly if everyone simply let it go. A young barista, no older than 20, murmured to a coworker that the man was the mayor's son, as though that single fact explained and excused everything that had just happened, and in a city like Ashbourne Falls, it often did. Braden, emboldened by the lack of resistance, kept talking, layering insult upon insult, working in cruel and pointed remarks about where Zuri came from, and what she must be doing sitting in a cafe dressed the way she was, each word landing with the casual confidence of a man who had never once faced a consequence he could not buy his way out of. Several of the onlookers, phones still raised, expected the young woman to break, to cry, to plead for someone, anyone, to intervene on her behalf, because that was the script this city had written 1,000 times before. Instead, Zuri reached into her satchel with steady hands, retrieved her phone, and dialed a number that nobody around her recognized, her voice calm and almost conversational as she spoke into the receiver. She did not ask for help. She did not describe what had just happened to her face. She said only a handful of words, quiet enough that only the people closest to her could hear them, words that sounded almost bureaucratic in their plainness. And then she ended the call and returned the phone to her bag, as though she had simply confirmed a lunch reservation. Braden sneered at her, calling the gesture pathetic, asking who exactly she thought she was calling that could possibly matter in this city. And Zuri looked up at him with an expression that unsettled more people in that room than the slap itself had. She said nothing further. She simply waited, and something about the stillness in her eyes made Peter Ellison's stomach turn in a way he could not explain, as though he had just watched someone light a fuse without knowing how long it was. 15 miles across town, in a nondescript federal building that most residents of Ashbourne Falls had never noticed despite driving past it daily, a phone rang on a desk that belonged to nobody in particular, because it was a line reserved for exactly one purpose. The message relayed through that line was brief, coded in language that meant nothing to an outsider, but triggered an immediate and coordinated response among a small team that had been quietly preparing for this exact moment for weeks. Within minutes, encrypted messages went out to 4 separate federal and state offices, each one a piece of a puzzle that had been assembled slowly and carefully under the cover of routine municipal audits and unremarkable business reviews. Nobody in Ashbourne Falls noticed the shift, because the machinery of federal investigation was designed to move without sirens, without spectacle, without anything that might alert the people it was closing in on. Unmarked vehicles began appearing near the county records office and the city's primary financial institutions before the coffee stain on the cafe floor had even been mopped up, their drivers dressed in plain clothes, carrying briefcases instead of badges displayed openly. There was no flashing light, no dramatic announcement, only quiet men and women walking into buildings with court-approved authorizations tucked into leather folders, requesting access to servers and filing cabinets that had not been touched by outside eyes in years. Several bank accounts connected to shell companies registered under addresses that traced back, however indirectly, to the Holloway family were frozen within the hour, their transactions flagged and suspended pending review. Meanwhile, at a secure facility on the outskirts of the city, technicians began mirroring the entirety of the municipal government's digital infrastructure, copying financial records, permit histories, and internal communications onto drives that would soon become the backbone of an investigation nobody in City Hall yet knew existed. Braden, of course, remained blissfully unaware of any of it. By that evening, he was already at a rooftop party 3 blocks from the cafe, retelling the story of the slap to a rotating audience of admirers who laughed along and told him he had done nothing wrong, that the woman probably deserved it for talking back to him in the first place. He posted about his night in vague, boastful terms to friends who would repeat his version of events to anyone who asked, painting himself as a man who had simply put someone in their place. Champagne flowed freely. Music thumped from speakers on the terrace, and Braden lifted his glass to toast his own name, as though the day had been a triumph, rather than the beginning of his unraveling. He had no idea that 72 hours earlier, federal auditors had already flagged irregularities in a land deal bearing his signature, and that his afternoon at the cafe had simply handed investigators the final piece they needed to move from quiet surveillance into open pursuit. Word of the incident reached Mayor Donovan Holloway before the sun had fully set, delivered not by his son, but by a nervous aide who had watched the footage circulating among staff at City Hall with a growing sense of dread. Donovan listened to the description with the careful, controlled expression he had perfected over 2 decades in public life, the same expression he used when a bridge project ran over budget or when a scandal threatened to touch his office, and then he picked up his phone and called the police chief directly. His instructions were simple and familiar to anyone who had worked under him for any length of time. Make this disappear, and make it disappear quietly. He wanted the cafe's security footage retrieved and reviewed before anyone else could access it, wanted witness statements gathered and shaped into something manageable, and wanted it made clear to anyone who had recorded the incident on their phone that cooperation would be rewarded and silence would be expected. The police chief, a longtime Holloway loyalist named Russell Fay, moved quickly, dispatching 2 officers to the cafe within the hour, under the guise of a routine noise complaint follow-up. They requested the footage from Peter Ellison, with a tone that made clear this was not truly a request, and Peter, terrified of losing his job and his standing in a city where the Holloway name touched every business license and health inspection, handed it over without argument. Witnesses who had been in the cafe were quietly approached over the following day. Some offered small favors, others reminded gently of debts owed or permits pending, all of them encouraged in one way or another to remember the incident as a minor misunderstanding, rather than the assault it had actually been. Donovan believed, as he always had, that a problem contained early enough could be smoothed into non-existence, a lesson his father had taught him, and his father before that, and for the first several hours, it appeared to be working exactly as it always had. That confidence began to crack the following morning, when a man Donovan had never met walked into his office without an appointment and introduced himself as Marshal Elias Monroe, a federal special investigator carrying documentation that required immediate and full cooperation. Monroe was 49 years old, quiet in demeanor but unmistakably serious, the kind of man who had spent 30 years learning that the loudest people in a room were rarely the ones who mattered. He informed Donovan, in measured and unhurried language, that all footage, documents, and communications related to the incident at the cafe were now considered evidence under an active federal inquiry, and that any attempt to alter, delete, or suppress that evidence would constitute a serious criminal offense in its own right. Donovan's practiced smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered it, insisting there had been some kind of misunderstanding, that this was surely a local matter that did not require federal attention. Monroe simply set a folder on the mayor's desk, thanked him for his time, and left without further explanation. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Donovan Holloway felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest, the cold, unmistakable weight of genuine fear. Donovan spent the next 2 days trying to determine exactly who Zuri Langston was and why a federal marshal had appeared in his office within hours of his son's outburst. and the answers he found unsettled him more with every phone call he made. A contact in the state attorney general's office, someone who owed Donovan a favor from years back, confirmed off the record that Zuri was not simply a private attorney, but someone with direct standing inside an active Department of Justice inquiry into municipal corruption, though the contact refused to say more than that. Donovan decided the wisest course of action was to meet with her directly, to handle this the way he handled everything, with charm, with regret carefully performed, and, if necessary, with the quiet offer of money that had smoothed over every difficulty his family had ever faced. He arranged the meeting through an intermediary, choosing a private conference room downtown rather than his own office. Believing distance from City Hall might make the conversation feel less official and more like two reasonable adults settling a private matter. Zuri arrived precisely on time, dressed exactly as she had been the day before, carrying the same leather satchel, and she sat across from Donovan with the same unshaken composure that had unsettled Braden a day earlier. Donovan opened with an apology that sounded rehearsed even to his own ears, expressing regret for his son's behavior, insisting Braden had been under considerable personal stress, and gently floating the idea that perhaps a generous settlement, handled privately, might allow everyone to move forward without further disruption. He mentioned a figure meant to sound impressive, watching her face for any flicker of interest, any softening that would tell him she could be managed, the way everyone in this city had always been managed. Zuri listened patiently, let him finish completely, and then reached into her satchel and placed 3 items on the table between them: a federal credential, identifying her role within the Department of Justice, a court-authorized investigative order bearing a judge's signature, and a formal notice naming Ashbourne Falls Municipal Government as the subject of an active corruption inquiry. Donovan stared at the documents for a long moment, the blood draining slowly from his face as the full shape of his situation came into focus, and he understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to be useful, that he had spent 2 days trying to bribe and intimidate the very woman leading the investigation that would ultimately dismantle everything he had built. He asked, in a voice noticeably smaller than the one he had used moments earlier, how long this inquiry had been underway, and Zuri told him plainly that it had begun months before the incident at the café, that the slap had merely accelerated a timeline that was already in motion. She explained, without cruelty, but without softness either, that his son's actions had simply provided the final justification federal investigators needed to move from quiet observation into full and public action. Donovan sat in silence, staring at the papers as though staring hard enough might change what they said, and somewhere in that silence he finally recognized that he had, in fact, touched the wrong person entirely. Over the following 2 weeks, the investigation Zuri had been quietly building, for months, unfolded into something far larger and far uglier than a single confrontation in a cafe. Forensic accountants working alongside her team traced a pattern of shell companies registered to addresses connected to Holloway family associates, entities that existed on paper only to receive payments for municipal contracts that had never actually been fulfilled. They uncovered a scheme in which city land, technically owned by the public, had been quietly rezoned and sold at a fraction of its market value to development firms with hidden ties to Donovan's closest allies, generating profits in the millions that never appeared in any public disclosure. Bidding records for infrastructure projects showed a consistent and troubling pattern, with competing bids mysteriously vanishing from city files just before contracts were awarded to the same 3 companies, over and over, year after year. Braden's name appeared far more frequently in these records than anyone had initially expected, listed as a signatory or beneficiary on transactions tied to at least 6 of the shell entities under review. What had begun as an investigation into one wealthy family's abuse of local influence was rapidly revealing itself to be something closer to an organized criminal enterprise operating under the protective cover of elected office. Investigators found evidence of money laundered through a chain of small businesses, invoices padded for services never rendered, and payments disguised as consulting fees that flowed quietly into offshore accounts. There were indications that at least 2 city council members had received substantial personal benefits in exchange for approving contracts they knew to be fraudulent, and internal emails suggested that certain permit applications had been fast-tracked or blocked entirely based on whether the applicant had made an appropriate contribution to a Holloway-affiliated fund. Braden, it turned out, was not merely a spoiled young man who had slapped a stranger in a cafe, but an active participant in a financial network that had been quietly siphoning public money away from the city for the better part of a decade. The slap had not created the case against the Holloway family. It had simply opened the door to a case that had already been fully assembled and waiting. One of the more striking discoveries came from an examination of the city's largest public works project, a Riverwalk renovation that had been sold to residents as a symbol of civic renewal, promising new jobs and a revitalized waterfront within 18 months of groundbreaking. 3 years after the ceremonial ribbon cutting, the project remained less than half finished, its budget having ballooned to nearly 4 times the original estimate, with change orders signed by city officials who appeared, on paper, to have no direct connection to the contractor benefiting from each amendment. When investigators traced the ownership structure of that contractor through 5 layers of holding companies, they found it ultimately controlled by a trust registered under Braden's name, established when he was only 23 years old, and quietly funded through transfers his father had labeled as educational gifts. Retired city engineers, speaking on record for the first time, described being instructed to approve work that had never actually been completed, told that paperwork discrepancies would be corrected later. Corrections that, of course, never came. The Riverwalk had become, in effect, a slow and steady drain on public funds disguised as civic progress, one of at least 4 such projects. Investigators eventually connected to the same pattern of inflated costs and phantom construction. Equally troubling was the discovery of a private ledger, recovered from a safe in Donovan's own home study, cataloging what appeared to be years of informal payments received in exchange for zoning approvals, liquor licenses, and preferential treatment in city contract bidding. The ledger was handwritten, careful in its coding, referring to contributors not by name, but by initials and small symbols, that took investigators the better part of a week to decode fully. Once decrypted, it revealed a pattern stretching back nearly 9 years, implicating not only Donovan and Braden, but a small circle of local business owners who had quietly funded the family's influence in exchange for guaranteed advantages over their competitors. Zuri's team cross-referenced every entry against public records, building a timeline so exhaustive and so precisely corroborated by bank statements and permit filings that even Donovan's own attorneys, upon reviewing the evidence shared during discovery, privately acknowledged there was little room left to argue. As the scope of the investigation became clear even to those outside federal circles, Donovan Holloway shifted from damage control into open warfare, hiring a team of expensive defense attorneys and a crisis communications firm known for rehabilitating the reputations of politicians far more compromised than himself. He gave interviews describing the entire matter as a coordinated political attack designed to embarrass his administration and derail his upcoming re-election campaign, framing Zuri Langston as an outside agitator with a personal vendetta rather than a federal official conducting a lawful inquiry. His communications team began circulating stories suggesting the Café incident had been exaggerated or even staged, hinting that Zuri had provoked the confrontation deliberately to manufacture a narrative that would justify federal overreach into local governance. Supporters loyal to the Holloway name organized public rallies defending the family, insisting that decades of community service should count for something against what they called baseless accusations from unelected bureaucrats. The city, predictably, split sharply down the middle, with longtime residents who had benefited from Holloway patronage defending the family fiercely, while others who had watched contracts and opportunities repeatedly bypass them for reasons they never understood began speaking openly for the first time about years of quiet resentment. Anonymous accounts began spreading claims that Zuri had a history of fabricating cases against public officials, though none of these claims could ever be traced to a verifiable source, and reporters who attempted to investigate the allegations found nothing but dead ends and burner accounts created within days of the Café incident. Donovan believed, as he always had, that a strong enough counter-narrative could bury the truth beneath enough noise and confusion to buy time, if not outright victory. What he failed to understand was that every attack his team launched against Zuri only generated a fresh trail of evidence. Since crisis communications firms leave records, since coordinated smear campaigns require payment, and since every dollar spent trying to discredit a federal investigator had to come from somewhere that would eventually need explaining, Donovan's crisis communications firm went further still, arranging a series of sympathetic interviews in which longtime family friends described Braden as a misunderstood young man who had simply made a poor decision under emotional strain, carefully avoiding any mention of the racial slurs captured by multiple witnesses that day. They arranged for a handful of local business owners, men whose companies had benefited quietly from Holloway favor for years, to speak publicly about the family's supposed generosity toward the community, framing decades of quiet corruption as civic philanthropy. A billboard appeared briefly on the highway, leading into downtown Ashbourne Falls, funded through a political action committee with a name designed to sound grassroots, proclaiming that the city stood behind its mayor and would not be bullied by outside interference. Donovan even considered, for a brief and reckless moment, calling for a public rally in his own defense, a plan his attorneys eventually talked him out of, warning that any spectacle now risked drawing even sharper scrutiny toward exactly the kind of theatrical influence that had gotten his family into this position in the first place. Zuri had anticipated exactly this response, having seen the same pattern play out in 3 prior cases against powerful local officials who believed reputation alone could outlast documented fact. She had instructed her team from the beginning to treat any retaliatory campaign not as a distraction, but as an additional stream of evidence, tracking payments to the public relations firm, monitoring the origin of coordinated online activity, and documenting every attempt made to intimidate witnesses who had come forward. When a former city employee who had provided information about the rezoning scheme suddenly received a threatening late-night visit from men claiming to represent unnamed community interests, Zuri's team had already arranged discreet protective monitoring, having predicted that intimidation would follow disclosure as surely as thunder follows lightning. Each attempt by the Holloway camp to fight back in the court of public opinion instead deepened the paper trail, connecting Donovan's office to an increasingly desperate pattern of obstruction. By the time 3 weeks had passed since the incident at the Café, the case against the Holloway family had grown so thoroughly documented that even Donovan's own attorneys began quietly urging him to consider what a plea agreement might look like. The morning the warrants were executed arrived without warning to anyone outside the small circle who had spent months preparing for it, a coordinated sweep involving 4 separate agencies moving simultaneously across a dozen locations throughout Ashbourne Falls. Federal agents arrived at City Hall precisely at 8 in the morning, presenting Donovan's stunned staff with court orders authorizing the seizure of computers, financial records, and internal communications, dating back 6 years. Similar teams appeared at the offices of the 3 development firms most frequently connected to the fraudulent contracts, at a private bank branch that had processed an unusual volume of transactions tied to Holloway-affiliated shell companies, and at a storage facility outside the city where investigators suspected physical records had been hidden away from digital scrutiny. Safes were opened under judicial authorization, servers were disconnected and cataloged, and by mid-morning it had become impossible for anyone in Ashbourne Falls to pretend this was still a private family matter rather than a full-scale federal prosecution. Braden was arrested at his apartment shortly after 9, led out in handcuffs past a small but growing crowd of reporters who had somehow gotten word of the operation before it even concluded, his expensive suit and carefully styled hair standing in stark and almost comical contrast to the 2 federal agents flanking him on either side. He shouted something about lawyers and lawsuits as he was placed into the back of an unmarked vehicle, his bravado cracking visibly for the first time in his adult life, as the reality of steel handcuffs replaced the abstract idea of consequences he had always assumed belonged to other people. Donovan watched the footage from his office television with a stillness that unsettled the aides around him, his jaw tight, his hands folded on his desk, refusing to give anyone in the room the satisfaction of seeing him break. He maintained that composure right up until he glanced at the bottom corner of the seizure order delivered to his own office moments later, where a single signature authorized the entire operation, a signature he recognized immediately because it belonged to the same federal judge whose name Zuri Langston had invoked in that quiet conference room weeks earlier. In that instant, standing alone in an office his family had occupied for 3 generations, Donovan finally understood the full shape of what had happened to him. The woman his son had struck without a second thought, the woman he himself had tried to buy off with a settlement figure meant to sound generous, had never been a private citizen at all, but the very architect of the case, now dismantling everything his family had built. Every quiet call, every frozen account, every unmarked vehicle that had appeared in the days after the cafe incident traced back to a single decision made in a conference room. He had chosen himself, believing it would give him the upper hand. He sat down slowly, staring at the signature at the bottom of the page, and for the first time in his political career, Donovan Holloway had absolutely no idea what to do next. The preliminary hearing, when it finally arrived 6 weeks later, drew a crowd so large that additional overflow seating had to be arranged in an adjacent courtroom simply to accommodate everyone who wanted to witness the proceedings firsthand. Witnesses who had spent months too frightened to speak on the record now took the stand one after another, describing years of quiet coercion, permits denied for failing to make the right contribution, contracts steered toward companies nobody outside the Holloway circle had ever heard of, and warnings delivered in hallways and parking lots whenever someone considered asking too many questions. A forensic technician testified about the recovery of the full, uncut security footage from the cafe, footage that had supposedly been erased under Chief Fay's orders but had in fact been backed up automatically to a cloud server. Neither he nor Donovan had known existed. The restored footage showed not only the slap itself, but the full extent of what preceded it. Every insult, every racial slur, every moment of casual cruelty that Braden had directed at a woman he assumed could never touch him. The footage, played in full for the courtroom, landed with a weight that no summary or second-hand account had managed to capture, and even Braden's own attorneys visibly winced as it unfolded on the screen before them. Jurors and observers alike watched a young man who believed his last name made him invincible dismantle himself in real time, his arrogance on full display long before his hand ever made contact with Zuri's face. Additional witnesses described watching Chief Fay's officers pressure them into altering their statements in the days following the incident, corroborating exactly the pattern Zuri's team had documented from the very beginning. News coverage of the hearing spread rapidly across the region, no longer framed as a local dispute over a single slap, but as the unraveling of a political dynasty that had quietly exploited an entire city for the better part of a generation. By the time the hearing concluded, it was no longer a question of whether the Holloway family had committed crimes, but simply a question of how severe the consequences would ultimately be. Perhaps the most quietly devastating testimony came not from a stranger, but from Braden's own former college roommate, a man named Gregory Pierce, who had once considered him a close friend and had, years earlier, helped set up 2 of the shell companies later found to be central to the fraud. Pierce, granted limited immunity in exchange for full cooperation, described how casually Braden had treated the entire scheme, joking about it at parties, referring to public money as though it were simply an inheritance waiting to be collected a little early. He recalled a conversation from roughly 2 years prior in which Braden had bragged that his father could make any problem disappear with a single phone call, a boast that landed with particular weight in a courtroom, now watching that same confidence crumble in real time. Pierce's testimony did more than establish specific financial details. It painted a portrait of a young man raised to believe that rules were decorations meant for other people's lives, a portrait the jury seemed to absorb with quiet, grim recognition. By the time he stepped down from the stand, several jurors were visibly exchanging glances, and Donovan, seated beside his attorneys, stared fixedly at the table in front of him, rather than meet the eyes of anyone in the gallery. The sentencing hearing arrived on a gray morning in early spring, the courthouse steps lined with reporters and residents who had gathered not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a genuine need to witness the ending of a story that had defined their city for months. Braden stood before the judge in a plain suit, stripped of the swagger that had once defined him, his attorney arguing for leniency on the grounds of his age and lack of prior convictions, though the judge seemed unmoved, brackened by arguments that ignored the deliberate cruelty documented on video for the entire courtroom to see. He was sentenced to a substantial term in federal prison for his role in the financial crimes uncovered during the investigation, with an additional charge specifically tied to the assault itself, a sentence that acknowledged both the violence of that single moment and the corruption that had made him believe it would carry no cost. Donovan, appearing gaunt and years older than he had at the start of the ordeal, was formally removed from office days before his own hearing, stripped of the title that had defined his identity for 2 decades, and now faced a lengthy list of charges ranging from obstruction of justice to conspiracy to commit fraud. Several city council members and Chief Fay himself were named in subsequent indictments over the following months. The investigation rippling outward, exactly as Zuri had predicted it would, touching every corner of a system that had assumed itself untouchable. The Café on Cedar and Ninth reopened under new management, roughly a year after the incident that had made it briefly, uncomfortably famous, its interior renovated, and its old reputation for quiet exclusivity replaced by something warmer and more welcoming. Peter Ellison, who had kept his job despite his complicity in the early cover-up, made a point of publicly apologizing to Zuri, admitting on record that fear of losing his livelihood had led him to make choices he was not proud of, and that watching the case unfold had forced him to reckon honestly with the kind of silence that allows abuse of power to continue unchecked. Zuri accepted the apology graciously, without bitterness, understanding better than most people the particular kind of fear that keeps ordinary people quiet in the presence of entrenched authority. She told Peter that she held no anger toward the people who had stayed silent that afternoon, because she understood that an entire city had been trained, generation after generation, to equate the Holloway name with consequences too severe to risk challenging. Real change, she said, rarely came from the people at the center of an incident alone, but from the slow, uncomfortable process of an entire community deciding, collectively, that silence had cost them more than speaking up ever could. Several other former employees of the city, emboldened by watching consequences finally reach the Holloway family after years of assuming they never would, came forward in the months that followed, with their own accounts of quiet coercion, adding further weight to an ongoing effort to reform how contracts and permits were awarded within Ashbourne Falls. A new interim government, installed under state oversight while elections were reorganized, began implementing transparency measures that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, including public bidding records and independent audits conducted twice yearly by an outside firm, with no ties to any local family. A journalist covering the aftermath of the case, sitting across from Zuri in a quieter, less crowded corner of that same cafe, asked the question that had followed her since the very first day the footage had circulated. Why had she not fought back in that moment? Why had she simply reached for her phone instead of striking back at a man who had just struck her? Zuri considered the question for a moment before answering, her expression calm in the same way it had been calm on the day of the slap itself. And she said that when someone believes their power grants them permission to humiliate another human being, meeting that cruelty with more violence only proves them right about the world they think they live in. She did not need to strike back, she explained, because she had something far more permanent at her disposal. The simple, patient work of dragging the truth into a light bright enough that no amount of money or family name could dim it again. Power built on fear collapses the moment people stop being afraid, she added, and real justice rarely announces itself with noise, choosing instead to move quietly until the very moment it cannot be ignored. The journalist asked what she hoped people would take from the entire ordeal, and Zuri answered simply that no family name, however old or however deeply woven into a city's history, placed anyone above the reach of the law. It was, she said, the only lesson that ever really mattered, and it was one this particular city had needed to learn for far longer than anyone in it had been willing to admit. Zuri Langston walked out of the federal courthouse for the final time on a clear afternoon, past a long line of reporters, calling out questions she had already answered a dozen times over, her expression unreadable, her pace unhurried. As she reached the sidewalk, her phone buzzed once inside her satchel, and she paused just long enough to glance at the screen. A new case file arriving from a different city entirely, a different name, a different family convinced that their influence placed them beyond consequence. She allowed herself the smallest, faintest smile, the kind that belonged only to someone who understood exactly what came next, and slipped the phone back into her bag without a word. Ashbourne Falls would spend years untangling the damage the Holloway family had left behind, rebuilding trust in institutions that had been quietly hollowed out from within. But the lesson at the center of everything that had happened remained as plain and as permanent as the courthouse steps beneath her feet. No family, no fortune, and no last name would ever again be mistaken in that city for something standing above the law, and somewhere across the country, another city was about to learn the very same thing.